Welcome everyone to part 7 of module 9, which is social psychology. So what we're going to be looking at today is altruism, conflict, and peacemaking. So we're going to talk about some examples of this in class, but the first thing we want to talk about a little bit is altruism. Now, one of the big things about altruism to think about is why do people do things that are not in their self-interest, right? So, like I said, we'll go through some examples. But for example, one of the examples to kind of summarize it very, very briefly is the idea that there was a guy, he escaped from prison, and as he was kind of escaping, he was being chased by a guard. They were running over ice. The guard falls into the ice, right? Now, in his own self-interest, it makes sense for the man to just leave the guard and let him die, and because if he doesn't leave him, if he rescues him, right, he's going to be captured and he'll have to go back to prison. The man turns around and saves the guard, right? So the question would be, why do we sometimes do things, right, that benefit other people, right, or that are good for other people, even if it's a detriment to ourselves? And one of the reasons for that might be what we call altruism, right? So altruism is an unselfish regard for the welfare of others, right? Caring for others, even if it can be a detriment to ourselves. Now, we'll talk a little bit more, like I said in class, we'll kind of give some more examples and talk about it a little bit deeper. That's our general idea of altruism. Now, altruism is great, but there's also kind of the big question of, well, how come or why aren't we, altruistic all the time? Right? Why don't we always do kind of these things, right? Because sometimes there are cases where it seems like we should clearly step in, but we don't, right? A big example of that is the Rwanda genocide, right? So this is kind of actually a quote from it. How could it happen that America and the West stood aside and did nothing to stop the slaughter of 800,000 human beings over 400 days? So this is from the World's Failure to Act. It's an article, if I remember correctly. Looking at Rwanda, right? So why is it sometimes, though, that we can be altruistic, but other times we just kind of let these horrible things happen? So that gets us to what is called the bystander effect. Now, the bystander effect and bystander intervention is kind of the question that we're just asking in the last slide, right? Why is it that sometimes we don't step in? So what is the bystander effect? Basically what it is, it's the idea that people are less likely to help someone in need if there are other people watching in distress, right? So if we see something happen to somebody and they need help, but there's a bunch of other people there, that makes us much less likely to step in and actually help them. Now, obviously, we apply it a little bit differently, but we could apply it similarly or kind of at least slightly connected to the idea of like Rwanda, right? Where, if the whole world knows, well, why does it have to be our country that steps in, right? So you can kind of think about how these pieces are connected here. Now, to kind of continue this idea of bystander intervention, we want to know, okay, well, why does this bystander effect happen, right? What's going on here? And one of the reasons for it is what is called diffusion of responsibility. So diffusion of responsibility is basically the phenomenon in which someone witnessing a problem is less likely to help when others are present. And you can kind of see by this graph here, basically the idea is the more people that are around, the less likely we are to help, right? So if you're by yourself, you're very likely to help. If there's 4 other people, you're incredibly unlikely to help, right? So we're seeing this kind of connection. And again, the reason we're doing that is because when we have a bunch of other people around, it diffuses, right? That's the diffusion part, responsibility. If it's just me, I become almost entirely responsible for the care of this other person. But if there's a whole group of people with me, well, it's not necessarily my responsibility. What about everybody else, right? It spreads that responsibility out, and we assume that other people will take responsibility for it. And again, that's going to lead us not to act, not to take action. We have a similar idea here, or a little bit different theory, coming from John Darley and I believe it's Bib Latin, or Latini maybe. And so what they're looking at is basically they're saying there's actually 3 basically things that have to happen for us to take action, right? For us to attempt to help somebody. So those 3 pieces are, first, that we have to notice the incident, right? And you can see the little flowchart on the bottom. So we have to notice the incident first. We see something happen. Now, if we don't see it happen, we're obviously not going to help, right? So if we see it happen, the next thing we have to do is we have to interpret it as an emergency. So we need to see something happen, right? We need to interpret it as an emergency. So I see something happen and I say, oh, that person is in trouble, right? That'd be yes. If I see something happen, but I'm like, oh, they're fine, right? Then I wouldn't step in. After I interpret it as an emergency, I go to the third thing, which is I need to assume responsibility, right? That's what we just kind of talked about. So I need to assume responsibility for that person. Now, again, there's reasons why we don't. Maybe there's a bunch of other people and they think, oh, somebody else will help them. But if I assume responsibility, then I will take action, right? So the basic idea is you have to kind of check all these boxes. I have to notice the incident, I have to interpret it as an emergency, and then I need to take responsibility. I need to assume responsibility, and then I will attempt to help. Now, we can also look at a whole bunch of other different factors that are kind of intertwined here, right? So we know that when we look at bystander intervention, basically we can kind of look at it similar to with obedience, right? Where we can kind of increase the odds of people helping through a whole bunch of different factors. So I'm just going to kind of read through them really quick. So if the person appears to need and deserve help, again, all these are going to increase the chances we will help. If the person is in some way similar to us, if we have observed someone else being helpful, if we are not in a hurry, if we are in a small town or a rural area, if we are feeling guilty, if we are focused on others and not preoccupied, and if we are in a good mood, right? So all of those things will increase the chances that we actually help somebody. And again, we will look at some examples of, actual bystander intervention happen, right? And how it kind of looks and how it affects people. So then the question becomes, okay, well, what are the things then that cause us to help, right? If these are all the reasons why we don't help, why do we help people? Why do we go out our way to help people? So one theory of it is what is called the social exchange theory. It's pretty straightforward. So the social exchange theory is the idea that behavior is an exchange, right? Makes pretty good sense. So in this exchange, our aim is to maximize benefits and minimize costs. Okay? So when I do something, my goal is always maximizing my benefits, minimizing my cost to myself. So for example, when I do something, do I think I will get some sort of benefit out of it? Do I think I'll get some sort of reward? Do I think I'll get recognition? Right? In addition, what are the costs to it? Is it going to take a lot of time? Am I going to put myself in danger? What are the things that I'm giving up by helping? Right? So again, according to this theory, the idea is I want to get the maximum amount of benefits with the least cost, right? So kind of like I want to put in minimum effort, minimum time, but get maximum benefits. That's the kind of one way to think about this theory. Again, social exchange theory. Additionally, we have what is called the reciprocity norm. So a reciprocity norm is an expectation that people will help those who will have helped them, right? So when I do something for somebody, they will then do something to help me and vice versa, right? That's the idea of reciprocity. Now, again, obviously, if this is a norm and we expect this to happen, it's going to also possibly encourage us to help because I think, okay, when I help this person, they're eventually going to help me as well. Now, there is actually a human tendency towards reciprocity, and it's actually really, really strong to the point where people will feel obligated to return a favor, even if that other person doesn't want them to return this favor, right? And I'm sure most of you have either experienced this or know someone who is like this or is that person, right? Where somebody will do something for you and you have to do something for them, even if they're like, no, like, please don't do anything. Right, even if they tell you specifically not to, or you tell them not to, right? They do it anyway, right? That's this idea of reciprocity. We also have what is called the social responsibility norm. So the social responsibility norm is an expectation that people should help others who need help, even if we don't get any kind of benefit after, right? Even if we're not going to get repaid later. I actually kind of, whenever I think of this one, I think of like the Spider-Man and Uncle Ben conversation, right? That with great power comes great responsibility, right? That it is your responsibility to help others. When people need help, it is your responsibility to do so. That's kind of the idea of social responsibility norm. So those are all kind of these ways that we can think about, why do we help people? Why do we sometimes not help people? Now we're going to talk a little bit about conflict. So conflict is a perceived incompatibility of actions, goals, or ideas. Now, one thing I want to mention here is there's kind of a few pieces of this term or this definition I think are really important. One of them is the fact that the term perceived is in there. So the goals or actions or ideas don't actually have to be incompatible. We just have to think they are, right? We just have to believe that the difference between us is incompatible. Okay, and again, the incompatibility can be through actions, can be through goals, can be through ideas, right? We just have to have this perceived incompatibility. One way that we see conflict, or one way that we can see conflict, is what is called a social trap. So, what is a social trap? Basically, it's an idea, it's a situation where we have conflicting parties, right? Let's say we have two. So, we've got two parties. Now, in this situation, what makes it a social trap is that if each party pursues their self-interest as opposed to what's good for the whole group, it actually becomes mutually destructive. Okay? So again, when we have multiple parties, if each party pursues their own self-interest as opposed to the group interest, it becomes mutually destructive. So one example of that we can use is climate change, right? If climate change continues on and on and on forever and nothing is ever done to fix it, right? That is going to be a problem. We are going to deal with the consequences of that as an entire planet, right? Every single human being, regardless of where they live, will deal with the consequences of climate change. Okay? Now, the problem is, right, we have conflicting parties. We have a bunch of different countries, right? Now, for all of these different countries, it might be in their own self-interest, right? It might be what's best for the country if they do not follow, let's say like the Paris Climate Agreement. It doesn't have to be this one, but they don't do anything basically to stop climate change, right? If they can try to industrialize or continue to consume at a really high rate, right? That might be what is the best outcome for them, right, as an individual, as opposed to, cutting back and doing what's good for the entire group. But again, right, when all of the groups do what's best for them individually, what happens is it becomes mutually destructive. So, simple example of this, right, as the US, right, when we step away from climate change, well, what happens is a whole bunch of other countries step away as well, right? Because if we're not going to, do what's best for the group, why should they do what's best for the group, right? And then now we've kind of had this mutually destructive behavior. We'll look at a really good example of this video in class. Of basically a game show that was literally, the end piece of it is a social trap. Exactly. That's the whole point of it. So we'll look at an example of that in class as well. We can also talk about mirror image perception and a self-fulfilling prophecy. So first we're going to look at mirror image perception. So mirror image perception is mutual views often held by conflicting people. Okay? So again, mutual views held by conflicting people. So one example is this idea that we are peaceful and ethical and they are evil and aggressive, right? Now, again, this is something where depending on which side of this you are, you probably believe the same thing, right? When different groups of people look at each other, you can think about in-group, out-group, and in-group bias. Both groups tend to think that they're the good people and the other ones are the bad people. One example of this you can see I put up here. These are examples of propaganda posters from, I believe, World War I, if I remember correctly. I can't remember if this is World War I or World War II, but from one of the world wars, right? So this first one here on the left is, I believe, a German propaganda poster. So you can see the American plane and the guy with the American flag wrapped around his neck standing over a child, right, a dead child. And in here, if you kind of read, obviously I don't speak the language, but you can see like gangsters is one of the terms in here, right? Gangsters pilot is what I believe it says, or pilot gangsters or something like that. So you can see, right, this image of America as this evil, aggressive people. On the other hand, we can also look on the right here and look at an American propaganda poster, right? So in this one, we have Germany portrayed as this, giant brute, this ape, right, stealing Lady Liberty, right? Saying we must destroy this mad brute, right? And again, what we're looking at is this mirror image. Both groups view themselves as ethical and peaceful and good, and the other as evil and aggressive and kind of the evildoers in their story. So we can also then talk about what is called a self-fulfilling prophecy. So a self-fulfilling prophecy, very simply, is a belief that leads to its own fulfillment. Okay? Again, a belief that leads to its own fulfillment. So here's maybe an example of this, right? So let's say you have a belief that you are bad at math. Okay? You have this belief for whatever reason. Maybe when you're like in third grade, you do bad on a math test, and so you just think you're bad at math. Okay? Now, the way self-fulfilling prophecy works, again, is that this belief actually causes it to happen. So when I'm young and I have this belief that I'm bad at math, what happens is when I go to math class, I probably am not as focused, probably aren't working as hard, probably kind of given up. I've probably kind of focused more of my attention on other things because I think I'm bad at it. I probably put my time into other subjects as opposed to math, right? So then I do poorly on tests later on. I may get kind of negative sanctions from parents or from teachers because of that, right? And over time, what happens is I do that for year after year after year, eventually, right? Maybe I'm like a junior in high school, and I am, in a remedial math class, and I say, oh yeah, I'm just bad at math. Well, the reality is maybe the reason you were bad at math is because you actually thought you were, right? And you created that to kind of happen. Now, again, we can do this a whole bunch of different ways. This is also something, self-fulfilling prophecy is also something we could tie into prejudice and discrimination. So I can give you another example here, right? So kind of similar here. A common kind of stereotype that we have is that women are not as good at math and science as men. Right? That's kind of a stereotype that I think has been around for quite a while here. Now, what happens is, again, this idea of self-fulfilling prophecy. So even if we don't directly say that, we might kind of teach that, right? When you go to science class, you probably learn almost exclusively about male scientists, right? About male mathematicians that had these breakthroughs, and we kind of skip the females. When you are going to these classes, right, you might get a little bit different teacher, or I don't want to say different teachers, different treatment from different teachers, not necessarily on purpose, but if I'm a teacher and I kind of have a belief, right, I might just treat you a little bit differently, right? If you do poorly on a test and I think that women are just naturally not as good at math, I might not think it's as big of a deal. I might not change what I'm doing. I might not feel the need to step in to see like, oh, hey, what's going on? Where maybe I would for somebody else, right? Again, over time, you learn that kind of belief. Even if you get through, right? Maybe you get to college and you look around and you're in these high-level math classes and all of a sudden there aren't any other females around, right? It's just you, right? And so again, we can think about, okay, the actual belief that I was bad at it caused me not to kind of get there, right? So this belief, again, fulfills itself, thus self-fulfilling prophecy. From here, we can talk about promoting peace. So we have conflict, right? We talked about kind of these different things that are connected with conflict. Obviously, too, maybe I could draw a little better for self-fulfilling prophecy. If I think someone's evil, right, I'm probably going to act differently, and that might cause them to do things that are maybe more negative, right? So we can think about how that's a self-fulfilling prophecy as well with conflict. So the question then is, we have all these different things that cause conflict. Well, how do we get to peace then, right? How do we promote peace? So there's a few different things that we can kind of do or we should focus on. One of the big ones is contact. Positive contact has been shown to produce positive feelings. So when we have two groups of people, if we can have them interacting with each other, right? We can have them have positive contact with each other. It will produce positive feelings, right? This is actually something we see if we want to talk about something like racism or prejudice. People that live in more multicultural communities tend to be far less prejudiced than people who live in ethnocentric communities, or like ethno communities where there's only one ethnicity or only one culture, right? Homogenous is the actual term I should use. Homogenous communities, right? So when we are interacting with other people, it tends to create positive feelings between those people. Now, should notice that it is positive contact. Obviously, if you're interacting with someone and you fight with them every time, that's going to produce negative feelings, right? So we want it to be positive contact. We do also see too that people actually kind of cause this lack of contact on their own. People tend to actually self-segregate. They segregate themselves from other groups. And they kind of tell them this kind of idea of like, I don't reach out because they don't want me to reach out. They don't want to interact with me, and that's why I don't interact with them. And again, obviously, you can think of how, well, both sides obviously kind of say the same thing. So both groups aren't reaching out because the other group isn't reaching out, right? And it's kind of that endless, cycle where nothing happens. So again, our first way that we can promote peace is contact. The next thing we can do is we can have cooperation, right? One of the best ways to get cooperation is through what are called superordinate goals. Okay, superordinate goals. Superordinate goals are shared goals that override differences among people and require cooperation. So a really good example of this we can actually see with World War II, right? So during World War II, the superordinate goal was to defeat the Axis, right? To defeat Japan, and then after that, defeat Germany, right? Which is kind of the main piece, right? Defeating Nazi Germany. So that overriding goal required cooperation. So because of that, right, one of the things we actually saw was specifically like the U.S. and the Soviet Union fighting together, right? They were both fighting together. They were allies against Nazi Germany, right? So they had this overriding goal, this goal that required them both to cooperate, to work with one another to achieve, and thus that created peace between them. Now, obviously, you can think of, and the reason I use that example specifically is that once that goal was gone, so once Germany was defeated, well, where did the conflict go? The conflict ended up being between the Soviet Union and the U.S., right? Because there was no longer this overriding goal, this thing that we have to cooperate to do. So now it kind of freed up the chance for them to have conflict with each other. There's actually an experiment done with this. So you can see the bottom piece here. In an experiment, Americans who read an article about a terrorist attack against all Americans expressed reduced prejudice to Black Americans, right? So this is sometimes why people will talk about 9/11, and after 9/11, how the entire United States came together, right? That's kind of the real world example of that, where when there was this thing that was bigger that required us all to come together to defeat, right? It actually made us more peaceful. It made us less prejudiced. It made us discriminate less. It caused us to just all kind of cooperate and get along better. So again, we have, at the moment, we have contact and cooperation. Obviously, you can think of how these two go together, right? You have to have contact and then cooperate. The next thing is communication. So communication, especially when we have a mediator or a moderator, right? Someone who can stand in between and kind of make sure it doesn't go poorly, can also change dynamics. So when we can start talking to each other, right? We can shift these kind of goals from being win-lose, where I achieve something and you lose, or you achieve something and I lose, to a win-win. How do we find the place where we both get something out of this kind of interactions we're having? And again, too, I want to mention, ideally, what we're going to see is all three of these. So we're going to see positive contact. We're going to have some sort of superordinate goal that we're all going to be able to cooperate on, and we're going to communicate about it. So we're going to do all these things at once, and that's going to go really far to promoting peace. The last piece here is conciliation. So for conciliation, we want to talk about what is called grit. Now, this is not the word grit, it is an acronym here. Okay, so grit stands for the Graduated and Reciprocated initiatives in tension reduction. Okay, this is a specific strategy designed to reduce international tensions. Okay, so it's a way of kind of getting towards conciliation. Okay, I want to be really clear here because we also used grit as reference to our ability to kind of like overcome and persevere and have passion about something. So this is different. Grit, all caps. So again, graduated reciprocated initiatives in tension reduction. So here's how this basically works. Okay, and you can see this is the bottom bullet point here. So one side announces its recognition of mutual interests. Okay, that's the first step. So we say, I'm going to use climate change as an example. So we look at another country. Let's say we have conflict with China, right? So us and China are kind of conflicting. The U.S. and China are conflicting. And we look across and we say, okay, you know what? We have mutual interests. We both want the world to be healthy and natural and be able to survive and all these other things, right? We want to stave off climate change. So, with the intent of reducing tensions, right? So I'm going to say I recognize mutual interest and I want to reduce tensions. I'm going to give these small reconciliatory acts, right? So I'm going to do these small things to try and reconcile. So, right, because of this, we need to work together, right? We have mutual interests. I want to reduce the tensions between us. So because of that, we're going to do these things. We're going to try and we're going to give you, we're not going to tax you this way, or we're not going to do whatever, right? We're going to do these small things that are kind of a sign of reconciliation. Now, the way this works is when we do this, the idea is what it does is it opens the door for the other group to also act in a conciliatory fashion, right? And you can think about how it connects to all these things, right? I'm communicating, I'm having positive contact with them, right? Because now, well, I just did something really nice for you, right? I'm looking at a superordinate goal, right? I've got this thing that's bigger than both of us. You can also think of one of the pieces we talked about before, reciprocity. When I do something nice for you, we human beings tend to want to do something good for them as well. So what that does is it opens the door now for that other group to also, right, do some small reconciliatory acts, and that reduces tension more, right? And you can see how, again, this kind of, the idea is we start a cycle where I do something small. I say, hey, I want things to get better. You can think about this, and this could also be like this is specifically for international tension, so between different countries. You can think about how this could work even in like a relationship, right? Maybe you get in a really big fight with your friend, and you say, hey, you know what? We both want what's best for our friend group or whatever, and I really want things to get better. So, you know what? I can stop doing this to try and, make things better. Right? It's basically the same thing, just on a small scale. And again, what that does is it opens the door for that other person to do the same, right? Instead of kind of conflict, well, now they kind of go, all right, well, if you're going to do that, maybe I could also do this, right? And we kind of work our way down. We slowly kind of step our way down till eventually, ideally, we have peace and we have cooperation between these different groups or different countries or different people, however we want to look at it. So again, that's going to wrap up this whole section. Remember, we talked about altruism. We talked about why people help each other, why people sometimes don't. We talked about conflict and the different things that cause it. And then we talked about peace and trying to promote that peace. Take a few moments, do a short summary here, and I will see you guys next time.